Hello everyone, Stackhouse here. I shave, so I look a little different. Don't know if that's good or bad, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to talk about a topic that many of you had questions about, had mentioned on Facebook, on comments, or during rehearsal, and we simply didn't have time to break it down like we would want to, so that's why we're posting this video here. We're going to be talking about the drop catch today, which is a way of enhancing the sounds of our like doubles and triples rolls using a combination of wrist turn and fingers. Now the drop catch goes by many names. You hear it called the alley-oop, you hear it called the snap roll, you hear it called push-pull. However, I like to reserve the push-pull name for a series of strokes strung together using a wrist turn and finger technique, not an isolated moment of doubles, but a long string. And the push-pull really implies the notion of continuous motion, like push-pull, 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 push-pull. There's no stop to it, so it's not an isolated incident of notes. The drop catch is what I like because the name implies that you're catching the note, so movement stops. You're dropping and you're catching it into your hand to enhance the second note. So we're using our fingers basically to add velocity to the second note to make it sound just like the first. But you could call it the sticky thing if you wanted. The name doesn't matter. What really matters is that you understand the concept and the mechanics of movement behind the technique. So why do we use the drop catch technique? Well, we just said that it's a way to enhance the sound of our rolls, our isolated doubles and triples and so forth. And what we're really trying to do is to avoid the sound of a passive roll. If you were to take a ball and drop it at a certain height, it will never bounce back up to the same height. And then when you do that, when it bounces again, it won't bounce up to the same height. And if you listen to what's happening, each time it bounces, it gets a little softer, a little quieter, a little quieter, a little quieter. That translates really well to what we're doing on drums. A passive roll is if I were to drop the stick and just let it bounce on its own. And if I isolate two of them, the second bounce is not as high and is not as loud. So what the drop catch allows us to do, when we use those back fingers, we're adding velocity to the stroke, and so we can make the second stroke sound as big as the first stroke. So we're going to be able to push more air through the drum and activate our drum and have a much fuller, nicer sounding roll. Another reason why we like to use the drop catch is that we can actually control where that second note happens. Using a passive type roll, where you kind of just let the stick and gravity, do what it wants to do, we're really a victim of gravity and physics, and how fast we throw the stick down. If I throw the stick down really hard, the space is really wide. If I throw it down soft, the space is really soft. So I'm really a victim. I'm not able to control where that second note happens. What the drop catch allows us to do is to place where that second note is actually happening, so that I can now focus on rhythmic integrity in that roll. I'm not a victim to physics. I'm actually controlling and placing where it happens, which is very important to what we're trying to do here. So the first way we're going to address the drop catch technique is to exaggerate the motions that make it up. That way we can see and feel and understand how the wrist is supposed to work, the difference between open and closed hands, and how the fingers are supposed to help out with that. So we're going to exaggerate everything at first. When you play the drop catch at moderate tempos, the motions are much more subtle than that, and then when you get to faster tempos, they're even more subtle than that. Your fingers are very fast twitching fingers, and so you're going to utilize that. The first layer is to really understand the concept between an open and a closed hand. When you just let your hand naturally lie there, you'll notice that there's lots of space in between your fingers. That's a natural hand position, and that's an open hand position. Lots of spaces in there. A closed hand position is I just close the spaces. I don't actually squeeze or put pressure or activate muscles or tendons. All I do is just get rid of the spaces. That's the difference between an open and a closed hand. So An open hand is going to have lots of spaces, and you notice there's a natural gap in between your index and your thumb. That's a natural hand position. You don't have to try to make it happen, it just happens. So the first layer of the drop catch technique, we're going to see that we're going to throw our wrist down and let it stay down, but we're going to have an open hand position. And notice that there's a gap here. That gap is going to allow the stick to rebound up while our wrist stays down. I like to call this the garage door, and that's going to come up later. That's very important to have this nice open position. Now be careful. When you put a drumstick in your hand and you try to have an open position, many people do this sort of number, where these fingers are extended. They look open, however, the tendons and muscles are flexed. You're pushing that open, and the front of your hand is still closed. We don't want that. We want an open hand position where the entire hand is open and relaxed. It's very ergonomic and it feels good. It should feel good. If it does not feel good in your hand, reevaluate what you're doing. The next layer of the drop catch is to understand how our fingers work. So we've gotten this wrist motion, we know how the open hand works, but we need to understand how to catch things using our fingers, those fast twitching muscles. And really, if you don't have an understanding of how that works, you're going to struggle using the drop catch technique. So first, we need to isolate that motion. And one of the best ways to isolate that motion is away from the drum. And in fact, there's an exercise you can use with your sticks, just standing in line, whatever, for waiting for a class to start, whatever. You don't have to be behind a drum, but you do have to have some sticks. So I like to turn the stick over, and I'm going to hold it up, but you can hold it flat, but I'm going to hold it up so you can see it. And having the front of my hand is closed, not squeezing, but it's closed, I'm actually going to strike my forearm by just pushing with the pad of my index finger. And then I'm going to switch to my middle finger and just isolate that. There's no wrist turn. I'm just isolating that finger motion there. And then the next step, after my middle finger, I'm going to team up my ring finger and pinky finger together. That's going to save time in the exercise anyway. And also in percussion, more often than not, you see the ring finger and the pinky finger being a team anyway. You don't see much of the ring finger doing stuff by itself and the pinky finger doing stuff by itself. So I like to just team those up anyway. Even in traditional grip, the ring and the pinky is kind of a team anyway. So the first step was index finger, middle finger, back two fingers, and then the next rep is all fingers together. And you can actually just use this in the framework of eighth notes, so you can go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and middle and 2 and 3 and 4 and back and 2 and 3 and 4 and all of them 2 and 3 and 4 and just cycle through that. That's really going to help you understand what it feels like to pull the stick into your palm using just your fingers. It's not wrist turn, it's just fingers. And remember, it's going to work best if you hold it flat. I was just holding it up so you could see it better. Alright, the next layer of the drop catch technique is to actually understand our wrist and finger motions with the stick in our hand, because that's what we're doing. So we talked about having that open wrist position where our wrist stays down, our hand opens up. We talked about that little garage door. The little garage door is open there. Natural hand position. Now if we put our stick in our hand, we're going to throw the stick down with enough velocity to give us energy to work with. If you throw it down lightly, you're going to struggle through this whole process for many a moon. So throw the stick down with a lot of velocity. And I'm going to let my wrist stay down. Let's try it again. Notice that my hand is opening up, so that space is there. That garage door space, the stick is going to pivot up into that space, and I'm going to leave my wrist down. Back of the hand's open. In fact, if you notice the trajectory of the stick, the arch this way, there's also a same arch this way in the back of the stick. And that's going to push out against your back fingers. The pad of your back fingers, the pinky finger, and kind of in between the knuckles of your middle and ring finger, and your hand's going to remain nice and open. And you're only going to hold on to the stick just enough to where the stick can pivot and will not fall out of your hand. Basically, you're just relying on the friction provided by having fingerprints to hold on to the stick. It's very lightly, very lightly. I'm not squeezing, I'm not putting pressure. I'm just letting the stick have its full rebound energy while keeping my wrist down. Okay, so now that we know how this wrist turn, open hand motion works, where the tip of the stick rebounds up, the back of the stick rebounds down and pushes out against our nice open back fingers, we are now going to close the spaces in our hand to pull the stick back into your palm. And as you do that, you're going to feel the weight of the stick as you pull that back into your palm, and the tip of the stick is going to whip down, which is where your added velocity comes from to get better tone out of your second bounce there. And as you whip the stick back into your hand, you're going to use that rebound energy that you've created to help push your wrist back up into the upward position so that you're ready for a second repetition after the left hand does its version of it. And as you do this, please make sure that you're not doing a push out with your back fingers on this technique. It's really tempting to start trying to do that, but it's really just an opening of the hand and then you're closing it back. That's really all it is. I'm not trying to push or scoop, push it out like this. You're doing way too much with your fingers. You're just opening it up. In fact, on that very first stroke, I'm not doing anything with my fingers other than just relaxing it. The only time my fingers engage is when I'm ready to pull it back into my palm and close the spaces down in my hand. And you'll see on the rebound of the second stroke, I'm using that rebound energy to help with my wrist turn to put me in the position for another repetition. Alright, so we have exaggerated motions. We understand what these motions are at slow tempos. It's a very relaxed hand. And make sure that when you close your hand, you're not squeezing the close. Again, you're just pulling the stick back in your hand, you're closing those spaces down. That's all you're doing. You're not trying to squeeze. But let's bump this up to moderate tempo. We had talked about that we're exaggerating the motion, so what does it look like in application at a moderate tempo? So now I'm doing the drop catch here. And you'll notice the space in between my thumb and index finger, that garage door we talked about, that's closed now somewhat. There's still a little bit of a gap there, but it's closed somewhat. And you'll notice as you get faster and faster with it, the space closes down even more. Because what we're trying to do is now we're trying to create that V-notch so the stick, it's firm enough so the stick can push up against it. Stick has to have something to push up against so that we have leverage to push it back down. And also what that does, it allows us to be on top of the stick. It's very important to be on top of the stroke to be able to manipulate this. But the big takeaways from exaggerating the motions is that we throw the stick down, our hand relaxes enough for the stick to pivot up and the back of the stick to pivot down up against our back fingers, and then we're going to time the closing of our back fingers along with the upward motion of our wrist to whip that second stroke down. And as you do this, you should really feel the weight of the stick, especially in your back fingers. Feel the weight of the stick in the back fingers. That's going to help you whip the stick down. But you notice the back of my hand, while I still have a V-notch there, you see the activity in the back of my hand. And as we get faster and faster, those spaces in your hands are going to get smaller and smaller. And again, I have yet to squeeze the stick. I'm not squeezing the stick. And at moderate tempos, this is going to be mainly wrist turn and fingers. As we get faster and faster, the forearm starts to incorporate, which relieves some of the motion of our wrist. Remember, our larger muscle groups has more power and more endurance as we get faster. But the fingers are still doing the same thing. So when I've jumped up to where I'm doing forearm and fingers now, the stick is pushing up against my V-notch. My back fingers are still going, and then my forearm is also making that motion there. Now, when we exaggerate the movements, make sure we don't get too hung up when we start applying it to music about that big space we talked about there. Again, we were just exaggerating the motion so that we kind of understand what is happening there. As you play at a fast tempo, of course, you're not going to have this huge space in your hand because it's not going to work. But the concept is the same. Our hand is relaxed enough to allow the stick to pivot and push out against the back of our fingers, and then we can pull those back fingers back into our palm. Again, no squeezing. And this should feel very good to you. If you feel pain, if you feel soreness in the bone structure or anything, you really need to reevaluate what you're doing there. This should feel very good. And in fact, you could do this for hours on end and not even really notice it that much because it just feels so good to play it that way. But if you'll listen, I have a lot of sound coming out of my second stroke. If I try to do that the passive way, see, there's a huge difference there. And now I can actually control the space of where that second note happens. Instead of doing the passive way, where I really don't have control of where that second note happens. Let's talk about how this applies to left-hand traditional grip. So it's going to be the same concept of wrist turn and fingers for right now. There's going to be two big wrist motions, a down and an up, down, up, down, up, down, up. And there's going to be small wrist turns in between to help you with your springy fingers up here to help whip that stick back down. So, as you play a free stroke with your left hand, you notice that the only contact you make with the stick really is the webbing back here, which is going to help control the movement of the space so it doesn't wiggle around back there. And also the front or the intersection of your teardrop. That right there. You should never feel any pressure on the side of your thumb, the bone right there, because that's squeezing too much sideways. It's going to be the webbing is going to hold the stick to keep it from wobbling around, and it's going to be the front intersection of the teardrop. And for a free stroke, that's really the only thing that makes contact with the stick. In fact, it is the only thing that makes contact with the stick. Now, when I'm doing this in a drop catch to the left hand, the very first stroke, again, that's going to open up. So I'm going to disconnect just a little bit from the middle finger. I'm going to disconnect a little bit from the cuticle of the ring finger. And it's all going to be firm enough back here so the stick doesn't wiggle around. And I'm going to be pushing with the intersection of my teardrop with the thumb and index finger. And you see how my wrist turn helps facilitate that? So the stick bounces down, pushes up against my springy fingers right here, the teardrop, and then I'm going to push back down with my intersection of my teardrop with a little bit of my wrist turn to get that second stroke. And then once that happens, then I'm going to reconnect my ring finger cuticle, reconnect with the stick to help me push back up to reposition myself for another repetition. And again, this should feel really good. Don't fall into the trap of putting in pressure with the side of your thumb right there where you start to feel sore on the bone. That's a good indication that we're squeezing where we shouldn't be. And you're also not really doing that much with the webbing there. All the webbing does is only firm enough to keep the stick from wiggling around and to give you a nice platform so that you can manipulate things with your fingers. But really focus on that teardrop, that intersection of the teardrop. That is going to be where the magic happens. Okay, we know that everyone learns in different ways. Some people are visual learners, some people can read a book and learn it. Everybody learns different. So I know that explaining something one way may not strike a chord with you. So here's another way of looking at this drop catch technique. And we're going to be using free strokes actually. We talk about a lot of the wrist turn free stroke where the entire hand is nice and open. And it's all wrist turn. Fingers aren't doing much of anything except keeping the stick from falling down onto the floor. There's another free stroke, type of free stroke that we haven't talked about too much, but it's all finger motion. And it's going to actually work better at a little faster tempo than the slow, big free strokes that I was just playing here. And it's going to look something like this. So I'm basically kind of, dribbling the stick with my fingers, but it's still a free stroke. I'm not squeezing the stick. I can still hear the resonance of the stick come out. It's singing, it's vibrating freely. It's a free stroke, but it's just with the fingers. So there's a wrist version and there's a finger version. Now, in order to get this finger version started, it has to begin with a wrist turn. First stroke is a wrist turn, and that's going to activate our finger strokes with lots of velocity. But it has to come from a wrist turn first. And so if I do this in exercise form with eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, if I were to take the very first two strokes that I just did, 1 and, that's a drop catch right there. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. If I were to take the first two, 1 and. That's your drop catch. So that's another way of looking at it. It may help you out. It may confuse things more. I sure hope it doesn't, but let me know if it does, and I'll try to explain it a little bit better than that. So we know how to do the drop catch. So how do we practice it and apply it to music? Well, there's lots of ways to practice it. One way is just to isolate the motion. You don't have to put it in any kind of musical context. You're just isolating the motion. Another great way to practice it is actually double scramble. And in fact, that exercise is designed to use that technique, the drop catch technique. So you can actually play that exercise and start using that as a canvas to learn this technique. Another way to practice it is, of course, most schools have a double beat exercise. Again, those exercises are designed for that specific technique. You can also do your roll breakdown using that technique. There's all sorts of ways to practice it. This technique also applies to triple strokes. I know there are a couple instances of triple strokes in the show, and instead of just having one wrist motion and one finger motion, a triple stroke, you can apply the same technique as having two finger motions: wrist, finger, finger, wrist, finger, finger, wrist, finger, finger, wrist, finger, finger. And then, of course, that third stroke is your upward motion to reset for the next repetition.